Good evening, and welcome. My name is Stephanie Whigham, and I'm your host. In theater lore, the ghost light, usually a single bare light bulb on a stand, doesn't merely illuminate a dark theater. It serves a second purpose, to keep the ghosts at bay. The light creates a sphere of protection, but what sinister things lurk beyond that light? What tales will you find on the edge of the dark? Tonight's featured stories were both written in the early 20th century by women who were quite well known in their time, not only as authors and feminists, but also for ghost stories. Olivia Dunbar, author of our second piece tonight, wrote, "As there has always been a literature of love, so there has always been a literature of fear." And now, without further ado, we go to our actors live in their homes, eager to present to you the premiere of Tales from the Edge of the Dark.
Shadows on the Wall by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Adapted for radio by Stephanie Whigham. Directed by Picotto.
Rebecca sat in a wide flounce of back silk in the corner of the sofa, looking nervously from her sister Caroline to her sister Mrs. Stephen Brigham, who had been Emma Glynn. Emma had arrived at the house that afternoon. She filled a great rocking chair with her superb bulk of femininity and swayed gently back and forth, her black silks whispering and her black frills fluttering. Even the shock of death for her brother Edward, lay dead in the house, could not disturb her outward serenity of demeanor. But her expression of masterly placidity changed at Caroline's next announcement.
Henry had words with Edward in the study the night before Edward died.
Caroline!
I think Henry might have controlled his temper when poor Edward was so near his end.
Of course, he did not know.
Of course, he did not know it.
She turned on her sister with a strange, sharp look of suspicion. Then she shrank as if from the other's possible answer.
Caroline.
The married sister, Mrs. Emma Brigham, was now sitting up straight in her chair. She had ceased rocking and was eyeing them both intently with a sudden accentuation of family likeness in her face.
What do you mean?
Nobody means anything.
Where are you going?
I have something to see to.
The others at once knew by her tone that she had some solemn and sad duty to perform in the chamber of death.
Oh. Did Henry have many words with him?
They were talking very loud.
Mrs. Brigham looked at her. She had not resumed rocking. She still sat up straight, with a slight knitting of intensity on her fair forehead, between the pretty rippling curves of her auburn hair.
Did you ever hear anything?
I was just across the hall in the south parlor, and that door was open and this door ajar. I couldn't help it.
Everything?
Most of it.
What was it?
The old story.
I suppose Henry was mad, as he always was, because Edward was living on here for nothing, when he had wasted all the money Father had left him.
Not so loud. That was the gist, yes.
Oh, how he felt. It must have looked to him as if Edward was living at his expense, but he wasn't.
No, he wasn't.
And Edward had a right here, according to the terms of Father's will, and Henry ought to have remembered it.
Yes, he ought.
Did he say hard things?
Pretty hard, from what I heard.
What?
I heard him tell Edward that he had no business here at all, and he thought he'd better go away.
What did Edward say?
That he would stay here as long as he lived. And afterward, too, if he was a mind to. And he would like to see Henry get him out. And then...
What?
Then he laughed.
What did Henry say?
I didn't hear him say anything, but...
But what?
I saw him when he came out of this room.
He looked mad?
You've seen him when he looked so.
Do you remember that time he killed the cat because she had scratched him?
Yes, don't. Caroline!
Caroline re-entered the room. She went up to the stove in which a wood fire was burning. It was a cold, gloomy day of fall, and she warmed her hands, which were reddened from recent washing in cold water.
You left the door ajar, Caroline.
It's still swollen with the damp weather of the summer.
Just needs to be pushed harder.
Oh!
It is time you controlled your nerves, Rebecca.
It ought to be fixed if it's shut so hard.
It will shrink enough after we have had the fire a few days.
I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself for talking as he did to Edward.
Hush!
Nobody can hear with the door shut. I say again, I think Henry ought to be ashamed of himself. I shouldn't think he'd ever get over it, having words with poor Edward the very night before he died. Edward was enough sight-better disposition than Henry, with all his faults.
I never heard him speak a cross word unless he spoke cross to Henry that last night. I don't know, but he did, from what Rebecca overheard.
Oh, not so much cross as sort of soft and sweet and aggravating.
What do you think really ailed Edward? I know you said that he had terrible pains in his stomach and had spasms, but what do you think made him have them?
Henry called it gastric trouble. You know Edward has always had dyspepsia.
Was there any talk of an examination?
No.
It's Henry!
Mrs. Brigham noiselessly rushed across the floor, settling into a rocking chair again, and was swaying back and forth with her head comfortably leaning back. When the door at last yielded and Henry Glynn entered, he cast a covertly sharp, comprehensive glance at Mrs. Brigham with her elaborate calm, at Rebecca, quietly huddled in the corner of the sofa with her handkerchief to her face and only one small, uncovered, reddened ear as attentive as a dog's, and at Caroline, sitting with a strained composure in her armchair by the stove. She met his eyes quite firmly with a look of inscrutable fear and defiance of the fear and of him. Henry Glynn looked more like this sister than the others. Both had the same hard delicacy of form and aquilinity of feature. They confronted each other with the pitiless immovability of two statues in whose marble lineaments emotions were fixed for all eternity. Then Henry Glynn smiled, and the smile transformed his face. He looked suddenly years younger, and an almost boyish recklessness appeared in his face.
I declare, Emma, you grow younger every year.
He flung himself into a chair with a gesture which was bewildering from its incongruity with his general appearance. He leaned his head back, flung one leg over the other, and looked laughingly at Mrs. Brigham. She flushed a little, and her placid mouth widened at the corners. She was susceptible to praise.
Our thoughts today ought to belong to the one of us who will never grow older.
Of course. We none of us forget that. But we have to speak to the living, Caroline. And I have not seen Emma for a long time. And the living are as dear as the dead.
Not to me. If you will excuse me. Come along, Rebecca.
Caroline is completely unstrung.
His death was very sudden.
Yes, it was very sudden. He was sick only a few hours.
What did you call it?
Gastric.
You did not think of an examination?
There was no need. I am perfectly certain as to the cause of his death.
Suddenly, Mrs. Brigham felt a creep as of some live horror over her very soul. Her flesh prickled with cold from some inflection of his voice. She rose, tottering on weak knees.
Where are you going?
I have some sewing to do. Some black for the funeral.
She went up to the front chamber, which was her bedroom. Caroline was there. She went close to her and took her hands, and the two sisters looked at each other.
Don't speak. Don't. I won't have it.
I won't.
Later that afternoon, the three sisters were in the study. Mrs. Brigham was hemming some black material. At last, she laid her work on her lap.
It's no use. I cannot see to sew another stitch until we have a light.
I can barely see my letter writing either. Rebecca, you had better get a lamp.
It doesn't seem to me that we need a lamp quite yet.
Yes, we do. I can't see to sew another stitch.
Rebecca rose and left the room. Presently she entered with a lamp. She set it on the table, an old-fashioned card table which was placed against the opposite wall from the window. That opposite wall was taken up with 3 doors. The one small space was occupied by the table.
What have you put that lamp over there for? Why didn't you set it in the hall and have done with it? Neither Caroline or I can see it if it is on that table.
I thought perhaps you would move.
If I do move, we can't both sit at that table. Caroline has her paper all spread around. Why don't you set the lamp on the study table in the middle of the room? Then we can both see.
Rebecca hesitated. Her face was very pale. She looked with an appeal that was fairly agonizing at her sister Caroline.
Why don't you put the lamp on this table, as she says? Why do you act so, Rebecca?
Rebecca took the lamp and set it on the table in the middle of the room, without another word. Then she seated herself on the sofa and placed a hand over her eyes as if to shade them, and remained so.
Does the light hurt your eyes? Is that why you didn't want the lamp?
Oh, I always like to sit in the dark.
Ignoring her, Caroline continued to write, Mrs. Brigham to sew. Suddenly, Mrs. Brigham glanced at the opposite wall. The glance became a steady stare. She looked intently, her work suspended in her hands. Then she looked away again and took a few more stitches. Then she looked again and again turned to her task. At last, she laid her work in her lap and stared concentratedly. She looked from the wall round the room, taking note of the various objects. Then she turned to her sisters.
What is that?
What?
That strange shadow on the wall.
Oh.
Why don't you turn around and look?
I am in a hurry to finish this letter.
Mrs. Brigham rose, her work slipping to the floor, and began walking round the room, moving various articles of furniture, with her eyes on the shadow.
Look at this awful shadow. What is it? Caroline, look. Look, Rebecca, look. What is it?
All Mrs. Brigham's triumphant placidity was gone. Her handsome face was livid with horror. She stood stiffly, pointing at the shadow.
Oh, Caroline, there it is again. There it is again. Caroline, you look. What is that dreadful shadow?
How should I know?
It has been there every night since he died.
Every night?
Yes. He died Thursday, and this is Saturday. That makes 3 nights.
It looks like...
I know what it looks like well enough. I've got eyes in my head.
It looks like Edward, only...
Yes, it does. Only... Oh, it is awful. What is it, Caroline?
I ask you again, how should I know? I see it there like you. How should I know any more than you?
It must be something in the room.
We moved everything in the room the first night it came. It is not anything in the room.
Of course it is something in the room. How you act. What do you mean talking so? Of course it is something in the room.
Of course it is. It must be something in the room.
It is not anything in the room.
Good evening, sisters. What is that?
It must be due to something in the room.
Henry Glynn stood and stared a moment longer. His face showed a gamut of emotions: horror, conviction, then furious incredulity. Suddenly, he began hastening hither and thither about the room. He moved the furniture with fierce jerks, turning ever to see the effect upon the shadow on the wall. Not a line of its terrible outlines wavered.
It must be something in the room.
His face changed. The inmost secrecy of his nature seemed evident upon his face, until one almost lost sight of his lineaments. Rebecca stood close to her sofa, regarding him with woeful, fascinated eyes. Mrs. Brigham clutched Caroline's hand. They both stood in a corner out of his way. For a few moments he raged about the room like a caged wild animal. He moved every piece of furniture. When the moving of a piece did not affect the shadow, he flung it to the floor. Then suddenly he desisted.
Oh, what an absurdity. Such a to-do about a shadow.
That's so.
I think you have broken the chair that Edward was fond of.
Terror and wrath were struggling for expression on her face. Her mouth was set, her eyes shrinking. Henry lifted the chair with a show of anxiety.
Just as good as ever. Did I scare you? I should think you might be used to me by this time. You know my way of wanting to leap to the bottom of a mystery, and that shadow does look queer-like. And I thought if there was any way of accounting for it, I would like to without any delay.
You don't seem to have succeeded.
Henry's eyes followed Caroline's to see the shadow remained unchanged, and he quivered perceptibly.
No, there is no accounting for shadows. Ha! A man is a fool to try to account for shadows. Now, let us all to dinner and forget about empty shadows.
And they all left the room, but Henry kept his back to the wall as he left, as did indeed the others. Supper that night was filled with a palpable tautness.
I can't sit in that room again this evening.
Very well. We will sit in the south room. I think we will sit in the south parlor tonight. It isn't as damp as the study, and I have a cold.
So they all sat in the south room with their sewing. Henry read the newspaper, his chair drawn close to the lamp on the table. About 9 o'clock, he rose abruptly and crossed the hall to the study. The three sisters looked at one another. Mrs. Brigham rose, folded her rustling skirts compactly around her, and began tiptoeing toward the door.
What are you going to do?
I am going to see what he is about.
As she spoke, she pointed to the study door across the hall. It was ajar. Henry had striven to pull it together behind him, but it had somehow swollen beyond the limit with curious speed. It was still ajar, and a streak of light showed from top to bottom. Mrs. Brigham folded her skirts tightly, and she went with a slow toddle across the hall to the study door. She stood there, her eye at the crack. In the south room, Rebecca stopped sewing and sat watching with dilated eyes. Caroline sewed steadily. Mrs. Brigham, standing at the crack in the study door, saw Henry making systematic passes and thrusts with an old sword in the empty room with a sort of cold fury and calculation.
The source must be between the lamp and the wall. Well, I will not leave an inch unpierced. If I divide the space into mathematical sections, perhaps.
The blade gave out flashes of light. The shadow remained unmoved. Mrs. Brigham, watching, felt herself cold with horror. Finally, Henry ceased and stood with the sword in hand and raised as if to strike, surveying the shadow on the wall threateningly. Mrs. Brigham toddled back across the hall and shut the south room door behind her before she related what she had seen.
He looked like a demon. Have you got any of that old wine in the house, Caroline? I don't feel as if I could stand much more.
Yes, there's plenty. You can have some when you go to bed.
I think we had all better take some. Oh, Caroline, what?
Don't ask. Don't speak.
No, I'm not going to. But
Soon, the three sisters went to their chambers, and the south parlor was deserted. Caroline called to Henry in the study to put out the light before he came upstairs. They had been gone about an hour when he came into the room bringing the lamp which had stood in the study. He set it on the table and waited for a few minutes, pacing up and down. His face was terrible, his fair complexion showed livid, and his blue eyes seemed dark blanks of awful reflections. The next day was the funeral. That evening, the family sat in the south room. Some relatives were with them. Nobody entered the study until Henry carried a lamp in there after the others had retired for the night. He saw again the shadow on the wall leap to an awful life before the light. It was midnight before he went upstairs. Mrs. Brigham and the other sisters, who could not sleep, heard him.
After breakfast this morning, I must go to the city. I expect to be gone at least 3 days.
What?
your practice has already been neglected on account of Edward's death. How can you leave your patients now?
I don't know how to, but there is no other way. I have had a telegram from my old classmate, Dr. Mitford.
Another consultation?
I have business.
How very strange.
He did not say he was going to consult with Dr. Mitford.
Everything is very strange.
What do you mean?
Nothing.
Nobody entered the study that day, nor the next. The third day, Henry was expected home, but he did not arrive, and the last train from the city had come and gone.
I call it pretty queer work. The idea of a doctor leaving his patients at such a time as this, and the idea of a consultation lasting 3 days. There is no sense in it, and now he has not come. I don't understand it for my part.
I don't either.
They were all in the south parlor. There was no light in the study. The door was ajar. Presently, Mrs. Brigham rose. She could not have told why. Something seemed to impel her, some will outside her own. She went out of the room, again wrapping her rustling skirts around that she might pass noiselessly, and began pushing at the swollen door of the study.
She has not got any lamp.
Now what is she up to?
Caroline took the only remaining lamp in the room and followed her sister. Rebecca had risen, but she stood trembling in the dark, not venturing to follow.
Caroline? Emma? I think there's someone at the door. Bridget! There's someone at the door! Oh, right. She went out. Coming!
Across the house, Caroline and Emma entered the study. Caroline set the lamp on the table.
It was such a strange feeling. I felt compelled to see for myself. There.
Two shadows.
The sisters stood clutching each other, staring at the awful things on the wall.
Emma! Caroline! We've just gotten a telegram. Henry is dead.
Did Edward somehow find a way to enact his revenge from his shadowy afterlife? Or did Henry simply get the karma he deserved, only to find himself trapped forever alongside his victim? We may never know. Before we go on to our next piece, I'd like to take a quick moment to call attention to the donation links in the description. In times of uncertainty, we turn to art, to storytelling, to theater. If you believe in the importance of art and the power of stories to transform our lives, and if you're able, please support these companies that want nothing more than to continue bringing transformative stories to our community. And now, we go back to our actors and our final story of the night.
The Shell of Sense by Olivia Howard Dunbar. Adapted for radio by Stephanie Whigham. Directed by Jonathan Rhys Williams.
It was intolerably unchanged. The dim, dark-toned room. The comfortable, familiar things that my earthly life had been passed among. Incredibly distant from it all as I essentially was. I noted sharply that the very gaps that I myself had left in my bookshelves still stood unfilled. That the delicate fingers of the ferns that I had tended were still stretched futilely toward the light. That the soft, agreeable chuckle of my own little clock, like some elderly woman with whom conversation has become automatic, was undiminished. Unchanged. Or so it seemed at first. But there were certain trivial differences that shortly smote me. The windows were closed too tightly, for I had always kept the house very cool, although I had known that Teresa preferred warm rooms. And my work basket was in disorder. It was preposterous that so small a thing should hurt me so. Then, for this was my first experience of the shadow-folded transition, the odd alteration of my emotions bewildered me. For at one moment, the place seemed so humanly familiar, so distinctly my own proper envelope, that for love of it I could have laid my cheek against the wall. While in the next I was miserably conscious of how strange new shrillnesses, how could they be endured? And had I ever endured them? Those harsh influences that I now perceived at the window? Light and color so blinding that they obscured the form of the wind, tumult so discordant that one could scarcely hear the roses open in the garden below. But Teresa did not seem to mind any of these things. Disorder, it is true, the dear child had never minded. She was sitting all this time at my desk. At my desk. Occupied, I could only too easily surmise how. In the light of my own habits of precision, it was plain that that somber correspondence should have been attended to before. But I believe that I did not really reproach Teresa, for I knew that her notes, when she did write them, were perhaps less perfunctory than mine. She finished the last one as I watched her and added it to the heap of black-bordered envelopes that lay on the desk. Poor girl! I saw now that they had cost her tears. Yet living beside her day after day, year after year, I had never discovered what deep tenderness my sister possessed. Toward each other it had been our habit to display only a temperate affection, and I remember having always thought it distinctly fortunate for Teresa, since she was denied my happiness, that she could live so easily and pleasantly without emotions of the devastating sort. And now, for the first time, I was really to behold her. Could it be Teresa after all this tangle of subdued turbulences? Let no one suppose that it is an easy thing to bear, the relentless, lucid understanding that I then first exercised, or that in its first enfranchisement, the timid vision does not yearn for its old screens and mists. Suddenly, as Teresa sat there, her head filled with its tender thoughts of me held in her gentle hands, I felt Alan's step on the carpeted stair outside. Teresa felt it, too, but how? for it was not audible. She gave a start, swept the black envelopes out of sight, and pretended to be writing in a little book. Then I forgot to watch her any longer in my absorption in Alan's coming. It was he, of course, that I was awaiting. It was for him that I had made this first lonely, frightened effort to return, to recover. It was not that I had supposed he would allow himself to recognize my presence, for I had long been sufficiently familiar with his hard and fast denials of the invisible. He was so reasonable always, so sane, so blindfolded. But I had hoped that because of his very rejection of the ether that now contained me, I could perhaps all the more safely, the more secretly watch him, linger near him. He was near now, very near. But why did Teresa, sitting there in the room that had never belonged to her, appropriate for herself his coming? It was so manifestly I who had drawn him, I whom he had come to seek.
Are you there, Teresa?
He expected to find her then? There in my room? I shrank back, fearing almost to stay.
I shall have finished in a moment.
Quite all right. I shall sit and wait for you.
No spirit still unreleased can understand the pang that I felt with Alan sitting almost within my touch. Almost irresistibly, the wish beset me to let him for an instant feel my nearness. Then I checked myself, remembering absurd, piteous, human fears, that my too unguarded closeness might alarm him. It was not so remote a time that I myself had known them, those blind, uncouth timidities. I came therefore somewhat nearer, but I did not touch him. I merely leaned toward him and with incredible softness whispered his name. That much I could not have forborne. The spell of life was still too strong in me.
Teresa.
In that instant the last veil fell, and desperately, scarce believingly, I beheld how it stood between them, those two. She turned to him, that gentle look of hers.
Forgive me, but I had suddenly the most unaccountable sensation. Can there be too many windows open? There is such a chill about.
There are no windows open. I took care to shut out the chill. You are not well, Alan.
Perhaps not. And yet, I feel no illness, apart from this abominable sensation that persists. Teresa, you must tell me. Do I fancy it, or do you, too, feel something strange here?
Oh, there is something very strange here. There always will be.
Good heavens. I didn't mean that. I know, of course, that you have your beliefs, and I respect them, but you know equally well that I have nothing of the sort. So don't let us conjure up anything inexplicable.
I stayed impalpably, imponderably near him. Wretched and bereft though I was, I could not have left him while he stood denying me.
What I mean is a special and almost ominous sense of cold. Upon my soul, Teresa, if I were superstitious, I should probably imagine it to seem the presence.
Don't say that, Alan. Don't think it, I beg of you. I've tried so hard myself not to think it, and you must help me. You know it is only perturbed, uneasy spirits that wander. With her, it is quite different. She has always been so happy. She must still be.
I listened, stunned, to Teresa's sweet dogmatism. From what blind distances came her confident misapprehensions. How dense, both for her and for Alan, was the separating vapor.
Don't take me literally, Teresa. I'm not speaking of what you call spirits. It's something much more terrible. If I did not positively know that I had never done her any harm, I should suppose myself to be suffering from guilt, from remorse. Teresa, you know better than I, perhaps. Was she content, always? Did she believe in me?
Believe in you? When she knew you to be so good? When you adored her?
She thought that? She said it? Then what in heaven's name ails me? Unless it is all as you believe, Teresa, and she knows now what she didn't know then, poor dear. And mine's.
Mine's what? What do you mean, Alan?
I, who with my perhaps illegitimate advantage saw so clear, knew that he had not meant to tell her. I did him that justice even in my first jealousy. If I had not tortured him so by clinging near him, he would not have told her. But the moment came and overflowed, and he did tell her. Passionate, tumultuous story that it was.
During all our life together, Frances's and mine, I've spared her, kept her wrapped up in the white cloak of an unblemished loyalty. But Teresa, now that the death has released me from my vow, you must tell me whether my long-kept love can be requited.
It would have been kinder, I now bitterly thought, if like many husbands he had years ago found for the story he now poured forth some clandestine listener. I should not have known. But he was faithful and good, and so he waited till I, mute and chained, was there to hear him. So well did I know him, as I thought, so thoroughly had he once been mine, that I saw it in his eyes, heard it in his voice. It lashed me with the whips of an unbearable humiliation. For I, his wife, had not known how greatly he could love. And that Teresa, soft little traitor, should in her still way have cared too? Where was the iron in her? I moaned within my stricken spirit. From the moment he bade her, she turned her soft little petals up to him, and my last delusion was spent. It was intolerable, and none the less so that in another moment she had, prompted by some belated thought of me, renounced him. Alan was hers, yet she put him from her, and it was my part to watch them both.
Oh, Alan, we can't. I couldn't, even now. Perhaps especially now.
I see. Of course.
I learned long ago that wishing cannot make things different.
Then, in the anguish of it all, I remembered, awkward, untutored spirit that I was, that I now had the great recourse. Whatever human things were unbearable, I had no need to bear. I ceased, therefore, to make the effort that kept me with them. The pitiless poignancy was dulled. The sounds and the light ceased. The lovers faded from me, and again I was mercifully drawn into the dim, infinite spaces. There followed a period whose length I cannot measure, and during which I was able to make no progress in the difficult, dizzying experience of release. Earthbound, my jealousy relentlessly kept me. Though my two dear ones had forsworn each other, I could not trust them. Without a ghostly sentinel to prick them with sharp fears and recollections, who could believe that they would keep to it? Of the efficacy of my own vigilance, I could have no doubt, for I had by this time come to have a dreadful exultation in the new power that lived in me.
Damn these creeping superstitions.
I drifted into his bedroom, delighting to watch him pace out his distress.
This house is full of cobwebs and drafts. Nothing more sinister than that. Francis barely dead a month, and you're already beginning to believe in spiritual nonsense? But these thoughts, so pale, so transient, they flicker. I feel as though I am paying some inevitable penance for a sin never committed, never even formed as a true thought, not concretely. Am I really guilty of some evil in silently loving Teresa all these years? Can a man's thoughts damn him just as surely as his actions would have?
It was my vengeance to allow him to believe this, to prod him ever to believe it afresh. I am conscious that this frame of mind was not continuous in me, for I remember too that when Alan and Teresa were safely apart and sufficiently miserable, that I loved them as dearly as I ever had, more dearly perhaps, for they were each of them something more and greater than the two beings I had once ignorantly pictured them. For years they had practiced a selflessness of which I could once scarcely have conceived. While I had lived solely for myself, these two divine creatures had lived exquisitely for me. They had granted me everything, themselves nothing. For my undeserving sake, their lives had been a constant torment of renunciation, a torment that they had not sought to alleviate by the exchange of a single glance of understanding. There were even marvelous moments when, from the depths of my newly informed heart, I pitied them, poor creatures, who, withheld from the infinite solaces that I had come to know, were still utterly within that shell of sense, so frail, so piteously contrived for pain. Yet the shy, hesitating compassion that thus had birth in me was far from being able to defeat the earlier, earthlier emotion. The two, I recognized, were in a sort of conflict, and I, regarding it, assumed that the conflict would never end, that for years, as Alan and Teresa reckoned time, I should be obliged to withhold myself from the great spaces and linger, suffering, grudging, shamed, where they lingered. If you see a heavy weight suspended from a slender string, you can know without any wizardry that in a few moments the string will snap. Well, such, if you admit the analogy, is prophecy, is foreknowledge. And it was thus that I saw it with Teresa and Alan, for it was perfectly visible to me that they would very little longer have the strength to preserve near each other the denuded, impersonal relation that they, and that I behind them, insisted on, and that they would have to separate. It was my sister, perhaps the more sensitive, who first realized this. It had now become possible for me to observe them almost constantly. The effort necessary to visit them had so greatly diminished, so that I watched her poor, anguished girl prepare to leave him. I saw each reluctant movement that she made. I saw her eyes worn from self-searching. I heard her step, grown timid from inexplicable fears. I entered her very heart, and heard its pitiful, wild beating. And still I did not interfere. For at this time I had a wonderful, almost demoniacal sense of disposing of matters to suit my own selfish will. At any moment I could have checked their miseries, could have restored happiness and peace, yet it gave me, and I could weep to admit it, a monstrous joy to know that Teresa thought she was leaving Alan of her own free volition, when it was I who was contriving, arranging, insisting. And yet she wretchedly felt my presence near her. I am certain of that.
The roast is particularly splendid this evening, don't you think?
I'm enjoying it a great deal.
The garden is near to blooming. It will be quite spectacular in the coming weeks.
Yes.
Perhaps you will join me for a walk after dinner?
Yes. Actually, there is a matter that I must discuss with you.
Teresa led the way. That dreadful daytime brilliance that in my present state I found so hard to endure was now becoming softer. A delicate, capricious twilight breeze danced inconsequently through languidly whispering leaves. Lovely, pale flowers blossomed like little moons in the dusk, and over them the breath of mignonette hung heavily. It was a perfect place, and it had so long been ours, Alan's and mine. It made me restless and a little wicked that those two should be there together now. For a little they walked about together, speaking of common daily things. Then, suddenly, Teresa burst out.
I am going away, Alan. I have stayed to do everything that needed to be done. Now your mother will be here to care for you, and it is time for me to go.
He stared at her and stood still. Teresa had been there so long, she so definitely to his mind belonged there, and she was, as I also had jealously known, so lovely there, the small, dark, dainty creature in the old hall, on the wide staircases, in the garden. Life there without Teresa, even the intentionally remote, the perpetually renounced Teresa, he had not dreamed of it. He could not so suddenly conceive of it.
Sit here on this bench beside me and tell me what it means, why you're going. Is it because of something that have done?
She hesitated. I wondered if she would dare tell him. She looked out and away from him, and he waited long for her to speak. The pale stars were sliding into their places. The whispering of the leaves was almost hushed. All about them it was still and shadowy and sweet. It was that wonderful moment when, for lack of a visible horizon, The not yet darkened world seems infinitely greater. A moment when anything can happen, anything be believed in. To me, watching, listening, hovering, there came a dreadful purpose and a dreadful courage. And then there came a brief space of terrible effort. All my fluttering, uncertain forces strained to the utmost. The instant of my struggle was endlessly long, and the transition seemed to take place outside me as one sitting in a train, motionless, sees the leagues of earth float by. And then, in a bright, terrible flash, I knew I had achieved it. I had attained visibility. Shuddering, insubstantial but luminously apparent, I stood there before them. And for the instant that I maintained the visible state, I looked straight into Teresa's soul. And then, thing of silly, cruel impulses that I was, I saw what I had done. The very thing that I wished to avert, I had precipitated, for Alan, in his sudden terror and pity, had bent and caught her in his arms. For the first time they were together, and it was I who had brought them.
My dear, what on earth is the matter?
Frances was here. You did not see her standing there under the lilacs with no smile on her face?
My dear.
I had so long lived invisibly with them, he knew that she was right.
I suppose you know what it means.
Dear Teresa, if you and I should go away somewhere, could we not evade all this ghostliness? And will you come with me?
Distance would not banish her. Have you thought what a lonely, awesome thing it must be to be so newly dead? Pity her, Alan. We who are warm and alive should pity her. She loves you still. That is the meaning of it all. And she wants us to understand that for that reason we must keep apart. Oh, it was so plain in her white face as she stood there, and you did not see her.
It was your face that I saw, and yours is the only face that I shall ever see.
Are you defying her, Alan? You must not. It is her right to keep us apart if she wishes. It must be as she insists. I shall go, as I told you. And Alan, I beg of you, leave me the courage to do as she demands.
They stood facing each other in the deep dusk, and the wounds that I had dealt them gaped, red and accusing.
We must pity her,
Teresa had said. And as I remembered that extraordinary speech and saw the agony in her face and the greater agony in Alan's, there came the great irreparable cleavage between mortality and me. In a swift, merciful flame, the last of my mortal emotions, gross and tenacious they must have been, was consumed. My cold grasp of Alan loosened, and a new, unearthly love of him bloomed in my heart. I was now, however, in a difficulty with which my experience in this newer state was scarcely sufficient to deal. How could I make it plain to Alan and Teresa that I wished to bring them together to heal the wounds that I had made? Pityingly, remorsefully, I lingered near them all that night and the next day, and by that time had brought myself to the point of a great determination. In the little time that was left, before Teresa should be gone and Alan bereft and desolate, I saw the one way that lay open to me to convince them of my acquiescence in their destiny. When they think of me, Alan and Teresa, I pray now that they will recall what I did that night, and that my 1,000 frustrations and selfishnesses may shrivel and be blown from their indulgent memories. Yet, the following morning, as she had planned, Teresa appeared at breakfast dressed for her journey. Above in her room there were sounds of departure. They spoke little during the brief meal, but when it was ended, Alan said,
Teresa, there is half an hour before you go. Will you come upstairs with me? I had a dream that I must tell you of.
Alan.
She looked at him frightened, but went with him to the library.
It was of Frances you dreamed.
Did I say it was a dream? But I was awake. thoroughly awake. I had not been sleeping well, and I heard twice the striking of the clock. And as I lay there, looking out at the stars and thinking of you, Teresa, she came to me, stood there before me, in my room. It was no sheeted specter, you understand. It was Frances, literally she. In some inexplicable fashion, I seemed to be aware that she wanted to make me know something. And I waited, watching her face. After a few moments it came. She did not speak precisely. That is, I'm sure I heard no sound, yet the words that came from her were definite enough. Then she went away. Was that a dream?
I had not meant to tell you, but now I must. It is too wonderful. What time did your clock strike, Alan?
2, the last time.
Yes. It was then that I awoke, and she had been with me. I had not seen her, but her arm had been about me, and her kiss was on my cheek. Oh, I knew. It was unmistakable, and the sound of her voice was with me.
Then she bade you, too.
Yes, to stay with you. Oh, I'm glad we told each other.
She smiled tearfully and began to fasten her wrap.
But you are not going now. You know that you cannot, now that she has asked you to stay.
Then you believe, as I do, that it was she?
I can never understand. But I know. And now you will not go?
I am freed. There will be no further semblance of me in my old home, no sound of my voice, no dimmest echo of my earthly self. They have no further need of me, the two that I have brought together. Theirs is the fullest joy that the dwellers in the shell of sense can know. Mine is the transcendent joy of the unseen spaces. And that was our show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please visit the links in the description and support your local theaters. Art is vital. Wishing you santé and sanity. Have a good night.